They called her the ghost of the kennels, the girl who was less than a shadow. Alara existed in the cracks of the Blackwood Pack's world, a smudge of soot and misery they tried to ignore. Her life was a litany of cold, the biting cold of the pre-dawn air as she hauled buckets of icy water, the chilling cold of hunger gnawing at her belly. But worst of all was the empty, desolate cold of being utterly alone. Her hands were raw, the skin split and bleeding from the lye soap and the rough bristles of the scrubbing brushes. Today's task was the great hall floor, a vast expanse of stone that seemed to drink the warmth from her very bones. She worked on her knees, head bowed, her world reduced to the scrape of stone and the sting of soap. It was better this way. To be invisible was to be safe. Mostly. She was an orphan, a stray pup taken in out of some long-forgotten sense of pity after her parents, exiled from a rival pack, had frozen in the dead winter pass. That pity had curdled into resentment long ago. She was a drain, a mouth to feed that offered nothing in return. She had no rank, no family, no worth. She was Omega, the lowest of the low, a living testament to failure. Look at it, slinking around like a worm. The voice sliced through the quiet scrape of her brush. It was Lyra's voice, sharp and cruel as a shard of ice. Alara flinched, curling into herself, hoping that if she made herself small enough, she might actually disappear. A polished leather boot kicked the bucket of dirty water, sending a foul gray wave across the stones she had just cleaned. The cold shock of it soaked the thin fabric of her trousers, clinging to her skin. A gasp of pain escaped her lips, swallowed by the cavernous hall. "Oops," Lyra sneered, her two friends snickering behind her. Lyra was an alpha's daughter, beautiful and lauded, with a heart as frozen as the peaks of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. Her jealousy was a poison she delighted in administering in small, daily doses. "You missed a spot, kennel filth." Alara didn't look up. She gritted her teeth against the burning humiliation, against the tears that threatened to fall. Crying only made it worse. Crying gave them something to enjoy. She simply reached for her rag, preparing to start over. "I'm talking to you," Lyra hissed, her boot pressing down on Alara's raw-knuckled hand. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up her arm. A scream tore at her throat, but she choked it back, turning it into a strangled whimper. This was her existence, a cycle of pain and endurance. She just had to survive until they grew bored and moved on. She just had to hold on. Her inner strength was a tiny, stubborn ember, refusing to be completely extinguished by the endless winter of her life. That night, huddled in her miserable straw bed in a drafty corner of the kennels, the dogs offering more warmth and companionship than any person in the pack, she saw something she was never meant to see. She had crept out for a drink of water from the well, her throat parched and her stomach aching. Through a crack in the armory wall, she saw Lyra's father, Alpha Valerius, meeting with two men cloaked in shadows. Their scent was wrong, acrid and dark, like burnt earth and decay. One of the men passed Valerius a heavy pouch that clinked with coin. The other handed him a scroll sealed with black wax, stamped with the sigil of a grasping claw wreathed in flame. The Ember Covenant. Traitors. Whispers of them had slithered through the territories for months, a dark cult seeking to overthrow the Alpha King himself. "The King's patrol routes," Valerius murmured, his voice low and greedy. "He rides north to inspect the Frostfang garrison tomorrow. He will be vulnerable." The shadowy man nodded. "Lord Vorlag will be pleased. Your ascension will be guaranteed once the old wolf is dead." Fear, colder and sharper than any winter wind, pierced Alara. This was treason of the highest order. An ambush. They were planning to murder the king. She had to tell someone. But who would listen to her? A worthless Omega? They would call her a liar, a madwoman. They would have her whipped for such an audacious falsehood. She backed away, a floorboard groaning under her slight weight. All three heads snapped in her direction. Valerius's eyes widened, first in shock, then in pure, murderous fury. Get her! Ilara ran. She fled into the night, her bare feet slapping against the frozen ground, but she was weak from hunger, and they were wolves. Lyra and two of Valerius's enforcers cornered her behind the smokehouse. The scent of pine and curing meat filled her senses, a scent she knew would forever be tainted by terror. You saw nothing, Lyra hissed, her beautiful face twisted into a mask of pure malice. You will say nothing. Ilara shook her head, terror giving her a sliver of courage. They'll kill the king. Let them, Lyra spat. My father will rule, and I will be his heir. We just need to make sure no little rats can squeal. She nodded to the enforcers. One grabbed Ilara's arms, twisting them painfully behind her back. The other forced her jaw open. Lyra stepped forward, a small, wickedly sharp blade in her hand. It glinted in the moonlight. You have always been worthless, she whispered, her breath ghosting across Ilara's cheek. But a voice is the one thing even the worthless possess. It's time we corrected that. The pain was unimaginable, a searing, blinding agony that erased thought, that erased the world. Her scream was a choked, gurgling sound, lost in a torrent of blood. And then there was only darkness. The coppery taste of her own life filling her mouth, and the echoing finality of Lyra's words. Now, go testify. They left her there, bleeding and broken in the snow. But the ember of her will, the stubborn refusal to simply die, flickered. She couldn't speak. She couldn't call for help. But she could run. Valerius and his conspirators thought her as good as dead, a voiceless creature who would bleed out or freeze before sunrise. With a surge of adrenaline born from pure terror, Ilara staggered to her feet. Blood streamed down her chin, staining the front of her thin tunic a horrifying crimson. She couldn't stay here. They would find her. They would finish the job. There was only one direction to go. Away. She stumbled out of the compound and into the deep woods, plunging into the teeth of a rising blizzard. The wind sliced like claws, whipping snow into a frenzy that blinded her. Every breath was a fresh wave of agony in her savaged mouth. Panic was a cold serpent coiling in her gut. But the image of the Alpha King, a man she'd never seen but knew to be the ultimate guardian of their people, pushed her onward. She had to warn him. How? She didn't know, but she had to try. The forest became a white-walled labyrinth. The world dissolved into a howling vortex of snow and wind and pain. Her body screamed for rest, for the sweet, deadly relief of simply lying down and letting the cold take her. But the image of that black wax seal, of Valerius's treachery, burned behind her eyes. She tripped over an unseen root, falling hard. The impact jarred her entire body, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. The snow was soft, almost welcoming. It would be so easy to close her eyes, just for a moment. A howl ripped through the blizzard, closer than it should have been. It was not the sound of a pack wolf. It was deeper, tinged with a raw power that made the very air vibrate. It was a sound of fury and pain. Driven by an instinct she didn't understand, Ilara forced herself up. She stumbled through the trees, following the sound. The blizzard was a physical wall, but she pushed through it, her freezing limbs moving on sheer, desperate will. She broke through a thicket of pine and saw him. He was massive, a giant of a man slumped against the base of an ancient oak. An enormous black wolf lay dead at his feet, its neck snapped. Another lay a few feet away, its fur matted with dark blood. The man himself was wounded. A deep gash ran along his ribs, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. Embedded in the tree trunk just above his head were 3 black-fletched arrows. An ambush. Valerius's ambush. He looked up as she approached, and her breath hitched. Even wounded and leaning heavily against the tree, he radiated an aura of absolute power. His face was harsh and predatorily beautiful, framed by a mane of wild, dark hair dusted with snow. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of molten gold, and they burned with an ancient, furious light. This was him, the Alpha King. He was dying. The cold was leaching the life from him, his movements sluggish, his breathing shallow. She could see the faint shiver that racked his powerful frame. He was alone, wounded, and freezing to death. Just like her. He watched her stumble closer, his golden eyes narrowed with suspicion and pain. He tried to push himself up, a low growl rumbling in his chest, a sound that should have sent her fleeing in terror. But she saw the agony in his gaze, the fight against the encroaching cold. She fell to her knees in the snow before him, her head swimming. She opened her mouth to try and warn him, to explain, but only a choked, bloody sob came out. She lifted a trembling hand, pointing back the way she came, then pointing at the dead wolves, trying desperately to communicate the danger. His eyes tracked her movements, a flicker of confusion in their golden depths. He saw the blood staining her chin and tunic, the raw terror in her gaze. He saw that she was just a girl, half frozen and grievously wounded herself. Another wave of dizziness hit her and she swayed. The world was tilting, the edges of her vision going dark. She was going to die here, at the feet of the man she had tried to save. A final, desperate instinct took over. Warmth. They needed warmth. She crawled the last few feet, collapsing against his side. Her body was so cold, but he was colder, his skin like ice even through his thick leathers. She pressed against him, trying to share the last dregs of her own fading body heat. Her raw, bleeding hand brushed against the bare skin of his wrist where his glove had torn away. The world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a cataclysm of light and heat and pure, raw energy that erupted from the point of their contact. A searing pain, 1,000 times worse than Lyra's blade, shot up her arm, straight into her heart, her soul. She screamed, but without a tongue, the sound was a silent, psychic shriek that echoed in the space between them. A mark, intricate as a snowflake and bright as a new star, burned itself onto the skin of her collarbone, a brand of silver fire that seared through her tunic. It felt like she was being torn apart and remade all at once. Her mind was flooded with images, with feelings that were not her own. Loneliness, ancient and vast as a glacier. The crushing weight of centuries of duty. A desperate, unending search for something he thought he would never find. For her. The king arched back against the tree, a guttural roar tearing from his throat. His golden eyes flared, becoming twin suns of incandescent power. The blizzard itself seemed to recoil from the force of the energy they unleashed. The heat was instantaneous, a furnace blast that melted the snow in a 10-foot circle around them. His head snapped down, his blazing eyes locking onto hers. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a look of stunned, absolute recognition. He saw not the kennel filth, Not the bloody, mutilated girl, but something else entirely. Something he had waited for his entire life. He reached out, his hand, now steady and strong, cupping her jaw with impossible gentleness. His thumb brushed away a trickle of blood from her lips. The pain in her mouth receded, replaced by a strange, tingling warmth. His voice was deep as thunder, a rumbling sound that vibrated through her entire being. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, of a universe snapping into its rightful alignment. You're her. Her mind reeled. What was happening? What was this fire in her veins, this impossible connection that hummed between them like a living thing? It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. Her instinct screamed at her to yield, to accept this impossible reality, but her mind, trained by years of abuse, shrieked in fear. This had to be a mistake, a hallucination brought on by pain and cold. He saw the terror in her eyes. He saw the confusion. He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. The torrent of his emotions poured into her through the new, raw bond between them. Protective fury, overwhelming relief, a tenderness so profound it made her want to weep. Then he spoke the word that sealed her fate, a word of possession, of destiny, of absolute certainty, a word that was both a promise and a cage. Mine. The world swam back into focus, slowly, reluctantly. The howling of the wind had been replaced by the crackle of a fire and the low murmur of voices. Alara was wrapped in thick furs, the warmth a luxury so foreign it felt almost painful. The throbbing agony in her mouth had subsided to a dull, persistent ache. She opened her eyes. She was in a large tent, the air thick with the scent of pine, wood smoke, and drying wool. A handful of warriors, massive men clad in black leather and steel, stood guard near the entrance, their faces grim. And seated on a stool beside the cot where she lay, watching her with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs, was the Alpha King. He was no longer pale and shivering. The color had returned to his face, and though his arm was in a sling and his torso was tightly bound with bandages, he seemed to radiate a vital, dangerous energy. His golden eyes had softened from their blazing intensity, but they had not left her for a second. As her gaze met his, a jolt went through the bond connecting them. It was a living current, humming just beneath her skin. She could feel his relief at her waking, a wave of emotion so powerful it was nearly her own. He gently took her hand, his large palm engulfing hers. "It does not matter," he murmured, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I can hear you." Could he? Could he hear the frantic, terrified thoughts tumbling through her mind? What are you? What is this mark? Why me? A faint smile touched his lips, a sight so unexpected and beautiful it was like watching the sun rise after a long night. "I am Kale. This mark," he said, his gaze dropping to her collarbone, where the silvery symbol pulsed with a faint light beneath her tunic, "is the sign of the soul bond. It means you are my mate, the other half of my soul. And as for why you, I have been searching for you for 500 years. 500 years. The number was incomprehensible, ancient. He was ancient, and she was a nobody. This couldn't be real. Her mind, her entire life's experience rejected it. And yet, the warmth spreading from his hand, the undeniable truth she felt humming in the bond, contradicted everything she had ever known. Gunnar cleared his throat. "My king, the tracks we found, they were Blackwood Pack, Valerius's men." Kale's jaw tightened, and a flicker of cold rage crossed his features. He felt Alara's corresponding jolt of terror through the bond. His eyes softened again as he looked at her. "They did this to you," he stated, his voice a low growl. He gently tilted her chin up, his gaze searching. "Why?" She squeezed her eyes shut, the memory replaying in her mind. Valerius, the men from the Ember Covenant, the ambush. She focused on the images, the words, pushing them with all her might across the strange, new bridge between their minds. Kale went rigid. The air in the tent grew heavy, charged with his sudden, immense fury. His eyes began to glow, the gold turning to molten fire. The warriors by the tent flap took an involuntary step back, their hands gripping their weapons. "Valerius," Kale snarled, the name a curse. "He conspired with the Covenant. He set the ambush, and he tried to silence the only witness." His gaze fell upon Alara, and the rage was tempered by a wave of fierce, savage protectiveness. "He will pay for this. They will all pay." News of the king's mate spread through the war camp like wildfire. Whispers followed Alara as Kale kept her close to his side, his hand rarely leaving her arm or the small of her back. The warriors looked at her with a mixture of awe and confusion. She was so small, so silent, so plain. They saw the kennel girl, not the queen. She felt their judgment like a physical weight, reinforcing the worthlessness that had been branded on her soul long before Kale's mark had appeared on her skin. A few days later, from a vantage point high in the Rocky Hills, a scout spotted a lone figure watching the camp. Gunnar went to investigate and returned with a report that made Alara's blood run cold. "It was Lyra," he told Kale, his voice grim. "Valerius's daughter. She saw us from the ridge. She was looking right at the girl, and she saw the mark." Alara felt a spike of Kale's cold dread mix with her own fresh terror. Lyra knew. She had seen the impossible. She had seen the mute, worthless Omega she had mutilated, now standing at the side of the Alpha King, bearing his soul mark. Lyra would not see a miracle. She would see a threat. She would see a complication to her father's plans. Kale understood immediately. "She is no longer just a witness to be silenced," he said, his voice dangerously low. "She is a symbol. My mate. To them, she is now my greatest weakness." He tightened his security, surrounding Alara with his most elite guard. But Lord Vorlag and the Ember Covenant were insidious. They did not deal in open warfare when subtlety and terror would suffice. They were shadows, and they knew how to prey on the vulnerable. The attack came not with the clash of swords, but in the dead of night. A sleeping draught, odorless and tasteless, had been introduced into the water supply for the king's personal tent. Ilara, Kael, and his inner circle were plunged into a deep, unnatural sleep. Ilara woke to a gag being roughly tied over her mouth, a cruel irony, and her arms being bound behind her with chains that felt like ice and fire against her skin. Silver. The metal burned, and worse, it felt like a thick, cold sludge was being poured into the bond, dampening it, choking the connection to Kael. The feeling of his presence, which had become a constant, comforting warmth at the back of her mind, was fading into a distant, frantic echo. Shadowy figures swarmed the tent. They moved with silent, deadly efficiency. She saw Kael fighting against the drug, struggling to rise, his growls thick and slurred. One of the assassins drove a black-bladed knife into his shoulder, and he collapsed back onto his cot, unconscious. Panic, absolute and suffocating, seized her. They were taking her away from him. The severing of their connection was a physical agony, a tearing sensation deep in her soul that was far worse than any blade. She was being hollowed out, an essential part of her being ripped away. She was thrown over a shoulder and carried out into the night. The last thing she saw was Kael's still form and the darkness that swallowed the light of their camp. Despair, cold and complete, settled over her. She was alone again. The journey was a blur of pain and fear. The silver chains were a constant torment, not just on her skin, but on her very soul. The bond was a faint, frayed thread, and through it, she could feel Kael's distant, roaring agony and fury as he woke to find her gone. His pain echoed her own, a terrible, shared torment across the miles. She was taken to a grim, lightless fortress carved into the heart of a mountain. The air was stale, smelling of old stone and dark magic. She was thrown into a cold, damp cell, the heavy stone door booming shut with a sound of finality. Hours or days later, the door opened. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, radiating a palpable aura of malice and dark power. He was tall and unnaturally thin, his face a pale, sharp mask of aristocratic cruelty. This was Lord Vorlag, the Shadow King of the Ember Covenant. He glided into the cell, his dark robes whispering over the stone floor. He circled her like a predator studying its prey. "So this is the king's great love," he mused, his voice a silken, venomous whisper. "A mute little stray. How disappointing. I had expected something grander." He crouched before her, his eyes like chips of obsidian. "He is coming for you, of course. His rage is a beacon in the night. He will tear this country apart to find you, and that is precisely what I want." Vorlag smiled, a chilling, bloodless expression. "You see, the soul bond is a source of immense strength, but it is also a fatal flaw, a tether, an anchor. We have a ritual, a rather nasty piece of work, that will allow us to use that tether. We will pour all of his pain, all of his fear for you, back into him through this connection, amplified 1,000 times. We will break his mind before we break his body. And you, my dear, are the key." He stood and turned to leave. "Your king will storm my fortress to save you, and he will walk directly into a trap that will shatter his soul. The age of wolves is over. The age of shadow is about to begin." The door slammed shut, plunging her back into darkness. His words echoed in the oppressive silence. A key, a tool, a weapon to be used against the only person who had ever looked at her and seen someone of worth. The despair was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. It was all her fault. Her weakness would be his doom. She slumped against the cold stone wall, the silver chains eating away at her spirit. The bond was almost gone, a barely perceptible flicker in the vast, crushing emptiness. She was at her lowest point, stripped of everything, even the newfound hope that had just begun to blossom in her chest. She closed her eyes, tears of blood and sorrow tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. It was over. And then, in the deepest pit of her despair, she felt it. A single, defiant pulse along the frayed line of the bond. It was Cale. He was pushing past the silver, past the distance, past the dark magic with the sheer, indomitable force of his will. His presence flooded her mind for a brief, brilliant moment, not with words, but with a feeling, a promise, an unbreakable vow. Hold on. The thought was a lifeline, a burning star in her endless night. I am coming. The fortress shuddered as if struck by an earthquake. A deep, resonant roar echoed through the stone itself, a sound of pure, untamed fury that was more than sound. It was a shockwave of power. Cale. He was here. Guards scrambled outside her cell, their shouts laced with panic. Alara felt a surge of desperate hope, a wild, fierce fire igniting in her chest. She pulled against the silver chains, the metal searing her wrists, but she barely felt the pain. He was here. The door to her cell was thrown open, not by Vorlag, but by Lyra. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and manic triumph. "The Master wants you," she hissed, grabbing Alara by the arm and hauling her to her feet. "It's time for the show to begin." Lyra dragged her through chaotic corridors, past frantic Covenant soldiers buckling on armor and dark mages chanting hurried incantations. The sounds of battle grew louder, the clash of steel, the snarls of wolves, and overarching it all, Cale's terrifying roars of rage. They emerged into a vast, cavernous chamber. A dark ritual circle was carved into the floor, pulsing with a sickly purple light. In the center of the room, Lord Vorlag stood, his arms outstretched as he channeled the dark energy. And on the far side of the chamber, the great iron gates buckled, groaned, and then exploded inward in a shower of twisted metal and stone. Cale stood in the breach, a figure of elemental vengeance. His golden eyes were blazing suns, his body wreathed in an aura of raw power. Behind him stood his warriors, their own eyes glowing, their forms shifting at the edges, more wolf than man. They fell upon the Covenant soldiers like a tidal wave of claws and steel. Cale's eyes found her instantly. He saw her in chains, saw Lyra's triumphant sneer, and his rage escalated into something transcendent. He charged forward, a blur of motion, cutting down anyone who stood in his path. "The ritual!" Vorlag screamed. "Begin the ritual now!" Dark mages surrounding the circle began to chant, their voices weaving a net of vile magic. Vorlag pointed a finger at Alara. "Bring her into the circle. Use the bond!" As Lyra shoved her toward the glowing runes, Alara felt the dark magic latch onto the bond. It was a hideous, invasive feeling, a poison pouring into the sacred connection she shared with Cale. Across the room, Cale staggered, clutching his head. He roared in pain as his own emotions, his fear for her, were twisted and weaponized against him. He fought it, pushing forward, but the psychic assault was relentless. He was being overwhelmed, his movements becoming sluggish. A hulking, heavily armored Covenant champion saw his opening and charged, swinging a massive, rune-etched axe. Cale met the blow with his sword, but the impact drove him to one knee. The dark magic pulsed, and he cried out again, his defenses faltering. Time seemed to slow down for Alara. She saw Cale, her mate, her king, the only light in her dark world, about to be struck down. She saw the axe rising for a final, fatal blow. The thought of losing him, of the bond being permanently severed by his death, was an agony beyond comprehension. It was a tearing of the universe. Something inside her broke. Not her spirit, a dam. A cage that had held back a power she never knew she possessed. It was not a decision, it was a reaction. A primal, unstoppable surge of protective love and incandescent rage. No. The thought was not a whisper. It was a silent, cosmic scream. The silver mark on her collarbone, which had been dull and faint, erupted. It did not glow. It detonated. A wave of pure white gold light exploded from her. It was not heat, but it burned. It was not sound, but it deafened. It was the light of a newborn star, the essence of life and healing and righteous fury made manifest. The wave of light slammed into everything in the chamber. The dark magic of the ritual circle evaporated with a sound like shattering glass. The chanting mages were thrown back, their robes smoking, their spells broken. The silver chains binding Alara's wrists turned to dust. Across the room, the light washed over Cale. It flowed into him, dispelling the dark magic, healing his wounds, and flooding him with a strength that made him roar not in pain, but in triumph. He surged to his feet, his sword a blur of silver light as he dismembered the champion before him. Lyra, who had been standing right beside Alara, was caught in the full force of the blast. She shrieked as the light scoured her, not burning her flesh, but burning away the shadows, the deceit, the cruelty. She collapsed, whimpering and broken. Lord Vorlag was thrown back against the far wall, the dark energy he commanded dissolving around him. He stared at Alara, his mask of arrogance shattered, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock and fear. What are you? He stammered, scrambling to his feet. Alara stood in the center of the chamber, bathed in the soft, residual glow of her own power. The kennel filth was gone. The broken victim was gone. She felt a strength she had never known, a sense of self that was entirely new. She was not worthless. She was not invisible. Vorlag sneered, trying to regain his composure. It doesn't matter. You are still just a tongueless little girl. You cannot even speak your own name. Alara met his gaze. He was right. She had no voice, but she didn't need one. Her power was her voice now. She lifted her hand, palm out, towards him. She didn't need to speak to reject the label he and the world had forced on her. She didn't need to scream to declare her new reality. Her very being was a declaration. I am Alara. I am his mate. I am your end. A concentrated beam of the same white gold light erupted from her palm. It was not a weapon of hate, but an instrument of pure, unyielding justice. It struck Vorlag in the chest. He didn't scream. He simply dissolved, his darkness unmade by her absolute light, his atoms scattered until nothing remained but a faint dusting of ash on the stone floor. Silence fell over the vast chamber, broken only by the last dying groans of the Covenant soldiers. The battle was over. Alara's light faded, leaving her standing, trembling slightly in the sudden quiet. The torrent of power receded, leaving her feeling drained but whole. Cale was there in a heartbeat. He crossed the chamber in 3 long strides, his eyes, now a soft, warm gold, devouring her. He didn't say a word. He simply pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, his whole body shuddering with relief. She wrapped her arms around him, holding on just as tightly. Through the bond, now clear and bright and singing with a strength that had never possessed before, she felt everything. His terror for her, his boundless pride, his overwhelming, all-consuming love. It filled all the broken, empty places inside her, healing wounds that were far older than Lyra's blade. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. His gaze dropped to her collarbone. The soul mark was no longer a delicate, silvery tracery. It had changed. It was now a brilliant, intricate sunburst of pure gold, pulsing with a gentle, living light. As he watched, an identical mark bloomed into existence over his heart, glowing through the leather of his armor. The bond was complete, reforged in fire and light, now a perfectly balanced, two-way connection. She had not just accepted his claim, she had actively claimed him in return. He touched the mark on her skin, his expression full of reverence. "Your power," he whispered, his voice thick with awe. "You are a sun singer, a healer of the soul, a legend I thought was lost to time." She met his gaze, and for the first time, she poured her own feelings intentionally into the bond. Her love, her gratitude, her acceptance of this new reality. "I am yours." He smiled, a true, deep smile that reached his ancient golden eyes. He understood perfectly. "And I am yours, always." He stooped and gently lifted her into his arms. She was weightless. She rested her head against his shoulder, a profound sense of peace settling over her for the first time in her life. She was safe. She was loved. She was home. Kale carried her out of the ruined fortress, through the ranks of his victorious warriors. They parted before him, their expressions of confusion replaced by ones of pure, unadulterated awe. They had all seen the light. They had all felt its power. They looked at the small, silent girl in their king's arms and saw not a victim, but their salvation, their queen. He led them back to the capital, a city of towering silver spires and ancient stone that had felt like an impossible dream to her. He did not hide her away. He stood on the great balcony of the citadel, overlooking the thousands of pack members who had gathered in the square below. He held her hand, raising it high for all to see. The matching golden marks on their skin blazed in the afternoon sun, a silent, irrefutable proclamation. He did not need to speak. Everyone understood. A single warrior in the crowd below raised his fist to the sky and howled, a long, joyous cry of fealty. Another joined in, and then another, until the entire city erupted in a thunderous chorus of celebration. It was a sound of acceptance, of loyalty, of a people welcoming their new queen. Alara stood beside her king, her mate, and felt the sound wash over her. It did not frighten her. It filled her. She looked out at the sea of faces, and for the first time, she did not feel the sting of judgment or the cold cloak of invisibility. She felt seen, truly and completely seen. Kale squeezed her hand, his love a warm, steady presence through the bond. He leaned down, his lips brushing her temple. He didn't need to speak for her to hear him. The words echoed directly in her soul, a final, healing truth that banished the last of the shadows. "Welcome home, my queen."